Good day, everyone. Welcome to our Q&A podcast. We are a full team today. Doug actually decided to show up
for work, eh?
Every once in a while. So, I don't mind. I'm here.
I did just realize Doug and I both have been welcoming people with the peace sign.
Oh, yeah.
Blake, you're just supposed to peace.
I always do this.
I just wave. I just wave.
So,
Yeah. There you go.
Good. Well, you guys ready? We're going to jump in. We said there was a question we were waiting for Doug for, and
which was awesome in light of all the other topics we talked about this week.
we did have
We
a
might
good
have
one
some
last
people
week.
in
If
the
you did not
seats.
hear the podcast last week, you should listen to it.
Yeah.
Because I thought it was good anyways.
I wasn't
not to
thinking-
toot your own horn or anything. Wow.
We just had some. I don't know that what I said was good. Kyle said good stuff. I always say that. But I thought the topics were very interesting last week.
yeah.
There was some hot topics there, so it was good.
After we do
We
our
have had some hot topic questions over the last little while, though,
Yeah.
which has been really interesting, and I've really enjoyed them.
Yeah.
But there's been some really thought-provoking questions
Yeah.
over the last little while.
Totally.
Keep
If
them-
Doug wants to jump in on any of the ones we did last week, he can quickly skim over them, I'm sure, if he wanted to.
yeah, he can at least do that.
He's the boss.
I would need to
Know what we said?
probably. I do need to know what they said.
What
I'm
kind of
being honest.
heresy we spewed?
I should have actually just listened to it so that I could just begin this podcast with recanting and apologies. So I haven't listened to it yet, so let me just proactively recant for all the heresy and apologize.
I didn't look at the questions yet. Did we get any follow-up questions? Did anybody think we had?
We did get 2 new ones, but I know we are not getting through what we had, so I didn't even put them in our list yet.
Okay.
Did we get 2 new ones that were related to the ones you asked last
No,
week?
none of them were related to the ones
Okay,
last
then we did a good job.
Yeah.
That's what I figured.
week. Or we just offended everybody so much they're like, not
Maybe
even
no
worth
one's listening at all
clarifying.
right now.
Not now, not after last week.
Well, 2 weeks in a row, you've left us to our own ourselves.
Yeah,
So
you
Yes.
leave us. We can say whatever we want. That's kind of the way it goes, I think.
who even knows what's out there in the internet, Doug? Oh man.
All right, are we ready?
I don't know now.
All right, I'm jumping in. Here we go.
Okay.
This is our first question. My wife and I am a woman, have been watching your services while looking for a new church in Airdrie, Calgary area. We love your messages and the idea of becoming love. On watching last week's podcast, which now
That was
is
a long while
a
ago.
few weeks ago,
Yeah.
we know you are not an affirming church, and we're okay with the idea of an accommodating church. Just to clarify, you spoke pretty strongly to what accommodating was, Doug. I like that. So if you haven't heard that, you can check out that podcast. Back to our question, but we're wondering what that looks like in our case. As an openly gay couple, would we be welcomed and encouraged to participate and serve in your church?
Yeah. And I want to say that this was the question that last week I said, please leave it, because I wanted to speak to it. And the reason I wanted to speak to it, at least part of the reason I wanted to speak to it, is because the personal questions are the ones that mean the most to me in this. I enjoy all the questions we get. I really enjoy doing this podcast. But some of the questions we get are just different thoughts on different things. But when we actually get a question from someone that I can tell is personal and is going to impact your life, those are the questions that for me are always the most meaningful.
Yeah.
And so that's why I wanted to be able to speak to this one. Before I get into giving my answer, though, I do want to say, when I spoke a number of weeks ago, and it was probably 4 or 5 weeks ago that we did talk about affirming, accommodating, I wasn't saying that we should just accommodate gay people. I was saying we all need to accommodate everyone.
Yeah.
That we are all sinners, and we are all on a journey, and we are all learning how to image Jesus by becoming love. And we all have areas of fallenness in our lives that manifest themselves in a wide range of different ways.
Yeah.
So I just want to make that clear, because just in the question they say, we know you're not an affirming church, and that word affirming typically is related to the question of someone's sexuality.
Yeah.
That is not something that we think about typically in the context of everyone. And so I don't want anyone to think that we're saying we will accommodate gay people. What I want to say is we will accommodate everyone. I am a broken person learning how to image Jesus better by becoming love better, every day of my life. That is what I am trying to do. So I would hope that everyone would accommodate me in my fallenness, whatever way that looks, as I would accommodate others. So I just wanted to start off by saying that.
Yep.
Now, in answer to the question, yes, you would be welcomed, and you would be invited to participate. Absolutely, we would want everyone to be welcome and to know they can participate in our church. That is unequivocal. But having said that, I would say again, we are a church that is on the journey to imaging Jesus by becoming love. And so while we would say corporately we want to extend that welcome to all people, I would hope that whoever asked this question would be accommodating to people as they would hope we would be accommodating to them. And I would also want to just be honest and real and say you may, if you came to this church, find some people who would not be affirming of your relationship. And that is the journey we're on. That is the tension we all live in as we walk out this salvation that we're called to work out. And so I don't want to paint a picture of, if you come here, everything will be roses and everything will be perfect and nobody will ever say anything that you might consider out of bounds. Because I can't guarantee that and I can't promise that. And that, again, doesn't just apply to gay people. That applies to everyone. Because every person who's ever gone to church for any length of time has been hurt by the church. Because the church is filled with fallen and broken people who are supposed to be on this journey. And so I would hope, whether I'm speaking to the people who are asking this question or whether I'm speaking to somebody else in a completely different context, that as you come, you would realize we're all on this journey together. And I would hope and I would ask you to accommodate us as we would hope to accommodate you. I think that's where, and I think this question specifically in those terms relates back to that podcast where I talked about accommodating versus affirming. And I would just hope that we can, if there's one thing I would hope, if there's one thing that is on my heart, if there's one thing that I pray about for the church more than anything else, is that we would learn this. We cannot claim to be becoming love if we can't be friends and love people that are different than us, that we disagree with, that live a different lifestyle than us, whatever it is. And I'm not, again, talking about gay, straight, I'm talking about everything. We were just talking about this before the podcast started, that we think we've advanced as a society because racism is no longer tolerated, but all we've done is redraw a line where we say, okay, it's no longer acceptable to not like somebody based on the color of their skin, but now it is acceptable to not like somebody based on their political leanings.
Absolutely is.
And we confuse changing one type of hatred for another type of hatred. We confuse that with progress, and that's not progress. And so I feel like I'm on a rant and way off of this question now, but that's just my honest thing. You are welcome here. We would love to have you here. I would hope that if you came and if you watch this podcast, you know what we look like. You can come and introduce us and introduce yourself to us, and maybe even be so bold as to say, we're the ones who asked that question. Thank you for your answer. Or we're the ones who asked that question. We think your answer was terrible. Whatever it is, that's fine. You will not offend me. If you're listening to this podcast, then you don't know what we look like. I'll let somebody else jump in there.
Totally. I will say, I think, just what your expression, I think the person may already see that they may face some of that there. Recognize you're not an affirming church, and we're okay with the idea of an accommodating church. I think that comes in mind, and I just want to maybe speak to that a little bit of going, I appreciate seeing that already in how you've asked the question. I have a number of people that I'm really close with that I've been able to grow in relationship with as I've journeyed through this question. I think of Brock, and I think of Ben, and I know they'll both be fine if I say it.
Well, I just find it funny that you're just casually referencing people. Like, these people watching the podcast know who you're talking about.
Well, some people do.
Some people might. I know not everybody
but
will.
some people have no clue. And
Yes.
you're thinking, Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny. Like, people would know if you said those people.
Yes. But anyways, there's people that have trusted me into their life as I have grown slowly over this, and very slowly, probably not as fast as I'd like, and how I can walk in an accommodating view, and those two guys particularly, being able to love me and let me learn as I've done that. And I've said a whole lot of things that I can look back and regret, and they have been willing to accommodate me as I'm learning to accommodate where they're at and walk together towards Christ. And so thank you for even the gentleness you've asked the question with, is all I'll say at this point.
You said something that made me think of, I saw a post, I think it was on Instagram yesterday, just said, how would you describe your church if you cannot describe your weekend services?
Right.
And I thought, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Like, I just thought, how do you describe your church if you can't describe that? Like, we have rockin' music, or our pastors are cool, or the sermons are great. If you can't say that, then how do you describe it? And right away, just the gifts of the Spirit came to my mind. I'm like, I don't know if we can describe our church that way, but that's what I'd hope.
Right.
I'd hope people would say, oh, our church is kind, our church is gentle, it's giving, it's
The
generous.
fruit of the Spirit.
Fruit of the Spirit, sorry. What did I say?
The gifts of the Spirit.
Yes, fruit of the Spirit, sorry. Yeah, and I just think that would be the way I'd want our church to be described. And when I look at this question, I go, yeah, we're in process, right? This question is big. I mean, we've talked about it at the board level, we've talked about it personally. This has just been going on for years now, this discussion in many churches, not just ours. And we're trying to figure out how to do the best at loving people.
Yeah.
But I would hope in that, and the mess that it is, meaning that there's people who are, not loving and they're hating and hurtful, right? And then there's people that are, and we're trying to all work together and love Jesus together, that out of that, people would describe our church as one who is kind and loving and gentle and good and all those things, right? So
And let me also just throw this out to speak to everybody who would listen to this podcast, that to ask the question to these two people, but also to everyone else, why do you want to come to church? And this is, I'm asking this question because this has been something that's been on my heart for the last month or so, is why do people come to church? What is their goal in coming to church? And I've been thinking about this for the last while because of the changes we've made to our gatherings and how we're doing things different and some of the discussions I've had as a result of those. I think, this personal opinion here, but I think the unspoken expectation a lot of people have in coming to church, and maybe they don't even realize it, is that they would have an experience with God. And that's why they want to come to church. But I do think that the purpose in coming to church was never meant to be to have an experience with God. I think that the purpose in coming to church was meant to be formed into the image of Christ. There's a massive difference between the two. Mm-hmm. And so I would hope to everyone who's watching this that they would understand that I come to church because it's in the context of those relationships with other people. It's in the context of setting time aside from all the other things of my life and taking some time to come and commit into a time of sanctuary where we sit in the presence of God, recenter ourselves around Christ in communion, and then have our interactive teaching time where we sit in a small group after hearing a short message and unpack what that looks like in our lives and how we incorporate it in our lives. That we would all come to church with the idea of being formed, being changed, and being transformed. Part of being accommodating, and again, I'm not just speaking to these two people, part of being accommodating is that we want to welcome everyone where they are, but part of being church is we're on this journey in change. And so I would hope that whoever asked this question, that in coming to church, you would have an open heart to Christ and to letting Christ move and challenge you and work in your life in whatever way he wants, because we're all on that journey. That is how we image Jesus better by becoming love, is by continually allowing ourselves to be formed by Christ into the image of Christ. Yeah. So if you're wanting to come to church, that's just a nice thing to do, and I'm not just speaking to these two people, I'm speaking to everyone. Yeah. If you want to come to church because you're just like, hey, I just want to come to church, because it would be just nice to go to church. It would feel good to go to church every once in a while. I do think the way we're doing church right now, you would maybe not find as rewarding as maybe a different church in town. Yeah. Because we're intentionally trying to shift our focus from providing an experience to saying be formed. Yeah. And we want to be a church where people are intent on being formed into the image of Christ. Yeah. And so I want to say that to everyone who's watching.
Yeah.
Why do we want to go to church? I grew up going to a Pentecostal church, and like I said, no one ever said this, but culture's not taught, culture is caught.
Yeah.
And what was conveyed through unspoken words was, we are here to have this experience with God, which then limits God and limits my thinking, and without ever even saying it, limits my idea of when God might move in my life to that short time, and then the rest of my life is my own.
Yeah.
And we want instead to say, this is a time when I'm specifically focused on being formed, but I'm open to God working in my life the rest of the week as well.
Yeah.
So I just say that to everyone who might be thinking about coming to our church ever, and maybe nobody's watching this podcast or listening to this podcast who doesn't come to our church, although clearly we have somebody who does, which is really exciting, and we love that you are doing this.
Yeah.
And it's exciting that someone actually, 'cause sometimes I wonder if anybody
Even listens to
even
this.
listens to this podcast, or if we just do this and then it goes on YouTube, and in 10 years if you went there, it'd be like, this has now one view.
Yeah.
So maybe there is, I have no idea. But I just say all that to say, if your heart in coming to church is that you want to just, have church and that's nice, I don't know that you will really enjoy what we're doing right now.
Yeah.
But if your heart in coming to church is, I want to connect with God, I want to recenter on Christ, I want to connect with God's people, and through that process I want to be formed into learning how to do life better and into becoming love better, because ultimately that's what it's all about.
Yeah.
And if we're transformed in the image of Christ, we will love better. Then I think you would find our gatherings to be of great value.
Yeah.
But I do think what we're trying to do right now in our gatherings is different, and I've been thinking about it lately, that it's different on a much deeper level than we've ever really even thought of before.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think we've covered the participate well, but just to clarify, I think, in stealing this totally from you, Doug, that something else we've said, it just in conversations not on camera, was talking about that serving's a part of that, of letting Jesus form us. And so for somebody to come and to serve is a part of one of the ways that Jesus does shape and form us. And so I think anybody that would want to come to our church aiming to become more like Jesus, opening their life to that, I think serving is a natural part that you have to be a part of in some way, shape, or form for Jesus to form you. Or the analogy I've used different times talking about this one is, we can't just eat, not work the calories out, right? We've got to be
Well, you can.
You can, but we're not called to be spiritual gluttons who are just consuming and not serving and not working out our salvation, so to speak. And so I think serving is a natural part of that, just to make sure the whole question is addressed.
But I do feel like part of that, though, is that we want people to connect with our church before they start to serve.
Yes.
We want to get
for
to know
sure.
you. We want you to get to know us.
Yeah.
So we don't have anyone who comes to our church in the first Sunday they're serving.
Not at all.
You have to come and you have to go, okay, this actually,
Yeah.
I'm seeing the value in this. I want to be a part of this. And then the opportunity to serve comes down the road further
Yeah.
once you've decided to make us
Yes.
your church home. So I view serving in church is great, but that is a little bit down the road
Yes.
for everyone, because you have to decide, this is the family I want to be a part of
Yeah.
before you serve.
Totally.
And we've had in the past people who've come in, I love this church, I want to serve, and we have put them right into serving roles immediately, and then in 2 months they're like, I hate this church and I'm leaving. And then we have issues.
Totally.
And so it's far better for us to say, come and join and be a part of what we're doing. And if you decide you want to be a part of what we're doing, let's talk about serving.
Yeah, totally.
So
That's you referenced The Patient Ferment last week, and I think we mentioned it many times on this podcast.
I'm going to be mentioning that book in everything I do for a long time.
The early church, or the first 300 years at least, was this process of entering a church. You had to have somebody that would ask you to come to church with them, and then they would teach you and shape you. And the biggest thing was not so much what you learned, but how you lived. Mm-hmm. If your habit of life matched what the early church was doing, then you got to be part of the church. You got to serve and do all those things.
Be baptized. And
And I think that word habit just makes so much sense to me. So when you're saying that, I'm like, yes, you would have to come here and first want to be here. because if you don't, then there's no point in serving here, right?
Totally.
And appreciate what we're trying to do here, because I think what we are doing here is very different than in a lot of other churches right now. So I think if somebody comes in, they could come to our gathering and go, "This is bizarre."
Totally.
Yeah. So they have to want to be here, and then once they do, then yes, we would have to see the fruit that you are being shaped to do what we do here, and then absolutely, we want you to serve.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
Cool.
So, thank you. I want to say again, thank you for asking that question. I love this. You have no idea how excited I was that somebody's listening to us. That was really, really awesome. Thank you. Thank you. So, just in asking that question, you brightened my day.
All right, we're gonna shift radically, as on this podcast we get questions from everywhere and anything. So here we go. Does Living Springs pay federal taxes? What is your view on tax exemptions for churches? Does that contradict? So if our view is this, does it contradict what Jesus said in Mark 12:17?
In Mark 12:17, just for context, Jesus says, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's."
Specifically in regard to a question that was asked to him about paying taxes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So, does Living Springs pay federal taxes? No. Living Springs would be charity, and it's not just churches that are tax exempt. It is all charitable organizations.
Yeah.
And so, my view on whether churches should be tax exempt is they are charity. They should function as charities, and they should exist to help other people, not for the purpose of making a profit.
Yeah.
And that's what a charity is. And so as such, the government recognizes you're not trying to make a profit, and to be honest, we don't.
Yeah.
So even if we did pay taxes, we wouldn't. But that's not our goal. So hey, look, we're not failing. Anyway, that they recognize that charity exists to help in some way in culture.
Mm-hmm.
And so the government says, because you are contributing into society in a different form, we are going to allow you to not pay taxes.
Yes.
And so my thing is, I don't have a problem with churches being tax exempt, but what bothers me is when I see churches who provide no or very little value to society around them. That's where it starts to bother me, because I think we should be people, and I hope people in Airdrie see value that our church brings to our city.
Yeah. I think, if our presence wouldn't be missed in Airdrie, which I think it would be from some of the conversations I've had, that from people that don't even attend our church, and some of the things we engage with on social media, with some things people have said about us from outside, there would be that. So I'd hope that would ring true. Maybe that's just me being biased and seeing it that way. And then this is more American stuff, but that's where I see a lot of stats. American. See a lot of stats and all those pieces where I go, I think there can be certain places where you could cross the line where I go, I think you can be eligible to compromise your tax exempt status. When you become about one thing or another that has nothing to do with why you were given that tax exemption in the first place, watching a church have a Republican candidate stand up and drum up support, or Democrat candidate for that matter, stand up and drum support and use your church tax exemption status to provide such a platform, I can see where that is valid to remove that tax exemption.
Well, and the rules for Canada are very different than the States. And in Canada, you couldn't do that.
No. And
and I think that a lot of times in Canada, we're unaware of how laws are different in Canada than the States, because we get so much inundated by American media
that we just assume
it's the same. And yet the rules for us as a charity with the CRA are very, very different and much more strict than with the IRS in the States.
So those things, I think, then that keeps that honorable, and I think keeps it. And maybe this is, I don't think you can ever enforce this. The one that breaks my heart, though, is when we see multi-million-dollar setups for where the money's going, and then, as we've already kind of addressed, if a church then doesn't provide something for the community, but we've got a $10 million, being hyperbolic, just for the sake of fun, a $10 million TV studio setup, and we gave $10,000 to the poor this year. I go, okay, well, maybe we can question that system there, but I know the heart of the rule, the heart of the exemption, in its best application, I think is greatly applied.
in principle, I might agree with you, but in practice, I would be cautionary.
Yes.
Only because I personally, I'm just very convicted of whenever I start to judge another ministry
Right.
and whether or not they're doing what God's called them to do based on whether or not it's what I would do.
That's fair.
I'm hesitant to go there.
Yeah.
That's not my area. So years and years and years ago,
Yeah.
I went to the Toronto Airport Christian Fellowship. It used to be the Toronto Vineyard Christian Fellowship when they were having revival, and there's all sorts of crazy stuff going on. People barking like dogs and people like just wild stuff. And I went partly because I wanted to just be open to God doing something in my life, but I also went partly to see the show because it was a show. And so the service started, and a few minutes in, a guy like 3 down from me started barking like a dog. And I was like, this is crazy town. And part of me was excited because that's what I'd gone to see, to be honest.
Yeah.
And just as quick as I noticed that and started judging it, I felt the conviction of God that this is not your house and you're not a pastor here. Yeah. So I'm not holding you responsible, so don't judge it. Yeah. And I've always remembered that. Yeah. That I ultimately, as the senior pastor, am responsible for everything Living Springs does. Yeah. And so I have to steer this ship, and I try to the best of my ability, to the path that God's calling me to go. But another church may do something that I completely disagree with. Yeah. But I haven't walked in their shoes, right. And so I'm not. I try really hard to distance myself from that, because otherwise we just get into the place where we're just all judging each other. Yeah. So
I hear you. You're right. I'm probably, my brain's still stuck on some of our questions from last week of how much money pastors could make, and
I was thinking this overlapped with it for sure.
Yeah, flying their private jet that they got paid for off of church salary potentially.
Look, I bought the jet used. Will you get off my back?
Exactly. And then all that money came tax exempt, or it's their second or third jet in their fleet. I'm going, that's where I really struggle. Of like, that's an extreme application for sure.
Absolutely. But again, that would be a difference between American and Canadian. Yes. So even the ability in the States for a church to own a business, and the ability in Canada for a church to own a business, we have much more strict rules in whether or not the church could even. So even if we decided we wanted to open a store with secondhand clothing as a service to our community, in order for that store to operate as a tax exempt, under our tax exempt status, there are a lot of conditions that have to be met. Cool. Otherwise, we have to pay taxes as a store. Right. Now the church, like once the store pays its taxes, the church can have the net income as a part of its ministry and redirect that tax free as the owner. But the business still has to make. Right. So that's the difference where you get into churches that have ministries. And again, I'm not judging what I'm saying. In the States, you can have a church that has a ministry that releases CDs, music CDs, that does different courses, that the pastor's written books. And the church is doing all this under the umbrella of the ministry, and it all remains tax exempt. Right. We couldn't do that in Canada the same way.
So if you flew a private jet out of here after this podcast,
I have to go to the airport. I don't have it in the parking lot. Don't be ridiculous.
Helicopter. Sorry, your helicopter on Wednesday.
Well, my helicopter's in the parking lot, but we weren't talking about that.
But okay, there you go. No, I appreciate. I have not had to be aware of the tax exemptions in Canada, so like you've said, presumed a lot of the American stuff.
And
so thanks for that.
No, so that's part of that is because as church leadership, we've talked about are there different opportunities, and what if an opportunity came along for us to purchase a business that we could run as a way to bless our city, but it would function as a business, as an income-making stream for our church. Yeah. And we've looked into and we've discussed those opportunities as a leadership level. Yeah. We've never reached the point where we felt like here's one we can present to the church, but we consider lots of different issues, and so as part of that, we actually looked into it.
Yeah, cool.
So, all right, moving on. This is a good one. I think Kyle might have.
Were the first two not good ones?
Yeah. They are all good, but I just.
This is what happens when I'm not on for a couple weeks.
Totally.
It's all
gets away with loose words.
Good one in the sense that there maybe, I don't know, there might be some debate on this one. So, does Jesus call his followers to complete pacifism?
Pacifism.
I can't even say it. Non-violence. If so, should Christians be participating in the military, the police force, or owning firearms for personal protection?
I'm just thinking about this going, okay, I think the two questions are different.
Yep.
And I think it's a fundamentally different thing to talk about being in the military or the police versus owning firearms.
Yep.
I don't think those are the same.
Well,
So-
for personal protection, I guess, puts the caveat on the.
I
purpose of
still
ownership.
say there is a fundamental difference between
Sure.
the military and the police,
Yeah.
and me owning a firearm for my personal protection. Those are completely
Yeah.
separate issues.
Yeah.
Yes.
They both fall under the topic of pacifism.
Yep.
But I would say,
You'd address one differently than the other.
yeah, I would say that they're not the same.
Let's parse it out then as we go.
Yep.
So, does Jesus call his followers to complete pacifism? Yes, I would say he calls them to pacifism.
Cool.
Should a Christian be participating in the military and police force? And this is where I think Kyle and I would disagree.
Yeah.
That I would say that being in the military or being in the police force is not mean you're not a pacifist. You are not functioning in your own authority in that. And so I recognize we've had this conversation before.
Yeah, totally.
So I would say that you could personally be a pacifist, but still be a police officer and say, as a police officer, I'm functioning as an individual authorized by the government to enforce justice
Yeah.
in my area of jurisdiction.
Right.
And so there's not a contradiction there.
Right.
That's where I would land,
Yeah.
but I know you would land somewhere different.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that you started off with a yes for the first portion there, and I've landed at a spot where I said I had a friend point out to me the other day that theologically they're like, you're an Anabaptist, you know that, right? I was like, oh, I guess I kind of am. So I'm embracing it now. I think with that applying to this question, I would hold that yes, I think Christians are to be complete pacifists, and I could even parse out each of these different things, and I recognize this is not a black and white issue, and so I know me landing one spot. There are people who are more educated and people that I call brother and sister and love very dearly that would land even on a no there, and I can agree to disagree with that. And I would parse out maybe even some of the next examples separately. I would argue more strongly for a Christian not participating in the military than even for the police force or owning a firearm for personal protection. I feel like the military is a complete different intent. I've had a conversation with a friend who has joined the police force, specifically talking about pacifism and that. And we kind of were able to agree on the pacifism part. We were able to disagree on the definition of violence. And so our conversation landed in the spot where for him it's a real personal struggle where he can be, this is just another example we came up with. If he was arresting somebody and they were resisting arrest, so he said sometimes it's necessary to kind of give them a punch in the shoulder to get them to release their arms so they can handcuff them. And he said, I don't feel like that's violence because it's the attitude by which he does that. And so he said, but I can give them one or two punches to try to do what's necessary for us to subdue them from hurting and harming somebody else. And then because that guy was a jerk, give him a third one for fun. And he said that's where he crosses into violence. And that's where Jesus would ask him to stop.
Yeah.
And so I go, I can see where you're at, and I can agree with you and all those pieces. And so for me, where I go, I think a Christian should probably stay back from joining the police force, is I would say, I don't think we should be doing anything that puts us that close to needing to make that call. That I need to, or I am tempted or put into a position where I could want to do that. Or I think there are any times where you are asked and given direct commands where you will eventually have to go against the kingdom of God to fight for the kingdom of Canada or the kingdom of somebody else in the military to implement Caesar's rules as in the police force. There will be times where we at some point will be asked to compromise our kingdom values, and so I would say the safer option is to not participate in those things, period. To jump into the last question, and then we can open it up for debate. I'm sure there might be some. As guns, I own a gun. I have that. I use it for hunting. I think we could have a whole nother question
That's
about
another
that.
question, yeah.
Right? That could be a whole other question. I will never say I own that firearm for personal protection. That gun will, no matter what, no matter if somebody comes into my house, threatens me with a knife or another gun, that gun will never be used against another human being, no matter what. They could have killed everybody in my house while I was asleep, and I wake up and I have that opportunity, and I have intentionally done things My wife doesn't know where the key is hidden for that gun because she doesn't have a firearms license. The ammo is kept separately from the gun. I have a trigger lock on it once you get into there. That gun will never be used for personal protection. I think that end of a Christian having a gun is completely wrong. That does not mean I'm against Christians owning firearms. So I parse out those questions all three separately.
I'd agree with your end part there, because I also own firearms, and my son the other day was asking for the combination to the keys, because he said, what if someone comes in here and I need to protect our family?
Yeah.
Which is funny anyways, because we live in a 2-story house. The weapons are like locked up like Fort Knox down in the basement. He's on the 2nd floor, so for him to hear someone in the house, bypass them, get to the basement to get a firearm to protect us, it's just not going to happen. But at the same time, I'm with you, Kyle. I'm like, no, I don't give anybody in my family opportunity to have those firearms for that same reason, that we keep them safe, and I don't need anybody protecting us with firearms. I'm like, that's just not a need.
The only guns we have in our house are Nerf guns.
And same thing, you better lock those up.
I don't. Leah uses them regularly. I've been shot numerous times. But I have shot her as many times as she's shot me.
Well, there you
in
go.
full transparency. I'm not pretending to be the victim here.
Just for total extra fun, I have one of the big Nerf guns with the big bullets, but I keep that one in my gun safe so the kids can't use that one against anybody else, because those things can totally take an eye out. So the kids can play with the little ones. I've got the big ones stored away.
All right, so with the police force, I think I want to address that. I don't know that I have a strong opinion. I have good friends. I have family that are in the police.
Yeah.
The thought that came to my mind, and you guys have talked about this probably more than I have been in the conversation, but I think of like Jesus saying seek justice, right?
Yeah.
And I think, okay, so do we do justice by protecting people from harm? Like my brother-in-law, who's a police officer, he tried to get me in the police. He's still trying to probably get me in the police for years. And that was always his thing, saying this is how he feels he is doing good for humanity, because he's protecting people from harmful people. Or people
Which I think
who are
is
doing
Romans
harm.
13, right?
Yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to affirm that. Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
In your discussion about why would you put yourself in a situation where you might at some point have to compromise?
Yeah.
Well, then you could say that about anything, right? Like,
Yeah.
where do you draw the line there?
Yep.
And that's where, for me, I go. I would agree with you that the idea of somebody being called by God to go help bring justice is a part of the character of God, and a reflection of the character of God. And I think if a Christian says, we should never, any of us, be involved in that, how could we ever be salt and light in that area of society?
Sure.
And I think there is a massive fundamental difference. And if I could just back up the bus to the pacifism part again, because I think there's oftentimes this tension that people have between, Jesus said, turn the other cheek, and Moses said, an eye for an eye.
Yeah.
Well, Jesus fulfilled the law, and Moses is not equal to Jesus. And so we don't hold any of the other stuff if you eat bacon, you can't quote an eye for an eye.
Yeah, totally.
I'm sorry. And there's people who separate out the Old Testament law and say, well, there was the moral law, and there was the ceremonial law, and there was the sacrificial law. Yeah. And they make it 3 laws, and yet the New Testament says to us the law cannot be broken. Yeah. And what you're trying to do is break it. And if you follow the Old Testament, you have to follow the whole Old Testament. And you either follow Moses or you follow Jesus. And that is the book of Galatians in a nutshell. So you can't say, I'm going to turn the other cheek, but then after I only got 2 cheeks, so after the second one, then I can punch them, because an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. I believe that if you didn't have the Old Testament, all you had was the New Testament and the teaching of Christ and the writings of Paul, I think that you would have to say we are called to be pacifists. I think of 1 Corinthians chapter 6, where Paul talks about lawsuits among believers. Yeah. And he says this, to have lawsuits at all with one another is already a defeat for you. Why not rather suffer wrong? Why not rather be defrauded? And I remember the first time I read that, and I was like, I can think of a million reasons why I'd rather not suffer wrong. But Paul is calling us here into this, and to be honest, none of us are there yet. This is all the goal we're striving towards as we become love. Yeah. But we are called, and this is why we're spending 11 weeks on the Sermon on the Mount, because we are called into this new kingdom created and inaugurated by Christ, where he says, come be a part of the kingdom. And like we're doing the Sermon on the Mount because this is what it means to live in the kingdom. And when we understand what it means to live in the kingdom, we understand it means a radically different lifestyle.
Yeah.
And it means a radically different lifestyle than even the Old Testament, where, as you've said before, the eye for an eye was not a justification, but it was a limitation.
Yeah.
Otherwise, an eye for a body. Like, I can kill you because you took out my eye.
Yeah.
So it was a limitation. But Jesus came and brought a new standard where he said it's not even just limiting the wrong you do to somebody else to the wrong they did for you, but instead it is forgiving.
Yeah.
And so I just want to just speak to that for a minute and just say it sounds radical, and I'm not there yet.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm being honest, I'm not. And I don't think any of us are. But I think if we decide we're going to pursue the task and the process of imaging Jesus by becoming love, it is going to require that we more and more embrace that. Yeah. And I don't want to sit here and sound virtuous, like I'm this perfect pacifist, and if you wrong me, I will know how to deal with it perfectly well, because that would be a lie. So I want to say that. But I do think if we're called to radically love people, then that ultimately is seen in the example of Christ, who allowed himself to be nailed to a cross.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
I was going to say, I think there's wisdom also that we're called to in this. Like, I think if I say, okay, then as a follower of Jesus, you can serve in the police force, I would not say that to every person.
Right.
Like, I think there is jobs, I think there is things that people do in life where, yes, as a Christian organization or, followers of Jesus, we should be in the world making change and fighting for justice. Not fighting for justice, seeking justice, doing those things. But not every one of us has the skill set to do that. Right? You could be a person who's a little more bent towards violence, and you probably shouldn't be a police officer, because that is just going to open the door for you to have to wrestle that all the time, right?
Yeah.
I think a few years ago, I remember an organization that was doing work within the pornographic industry, right? And they were going in and ministering to these ladies and stuff, and I was like, yeah, we can't just generally open that up to Christian men and say, hey, you guys should all be in there helping these poor girls. I'm like, obviously you would need to be wired a certain way to be able to do that.
And you would need to receive grace to be able to do it. God gives us grace that manifests itself in different gifts and in different ways, according to the book 1st or 2nd Peter. I can't remember which one. And so God puts a grace on your life to be able to do the things he's calling you to do. Totally. And I think part of our responsibility as followers of Christ is to figure out where that grace flows through my life.
Yeah.
So
I think, for me, and I really appreciate what you've said, Doug, and I can't necessarily disagree with it wholeheartedly and say, like, no, that's not right. But I guess I go, for me, I look at, and again, parsing out these, it can apply different ways. The Romans 13 part of submitting to authorities, and they're the sword by which God uses to keep order and all those pieces. I think there is something, there's absolutely truth to it, it's the Bible, but then so I look at something like World War II, and I go, I think God could have used the sword, so to speak, of the military to squelch what Hitler was doing and all those pieces, but I think that's a separate question from then how I can participate in that. I think that that way that by which the sword, some entity of the world, some kingdom of the world that Jesus is ultimately against, was actually somehow still bringing a good end, a more kingdom-like end, but then the Christian individual's opportunity to stand as a part of the world, the kingdom's sword, and follow Caesar's orders can also be quickly abused. How many armies in the world have done things that are completely counter to the kingdom, right? And you can't argue a direct order within there. And so the minute that organization crosses the kingdom line in any shape or form, you've got to go with it. And so I go, especially for the military, and again, I have people that in my life that are in the military and I love, and I can affirm that I believe they're walking out the best thing that they can, trying to follow Jesus. I'm looking at this as a theological question. It's so easy to cross those lines, to be serving another kingdom, in the military especially, and that military, that kingdom's ends, that I think that's the hardest one to even see how finally we could separate those things. Versus policing, I look at Canadian police, and Canadian police are trained way different differently and better than American police are, and so I can see it easier to serve in a Canadian police force than an American one as a Christian. How quickly they jump to violence in some, especially really tough areas in the States, how quickly they pull guns out, how quickly they go to aggression, versus Canada. I remember the guy who was running people over in Toronto with the van, and he was trying to egg on, like did a false kill or whatever, where it's called fake gun, death by cop, suicide by cop, and how firm that officer was in not using his firearm. I can see a lot more close to how a Christian should use a gun in the Canadian policing than in the American policing. So I go, okay, I get it. And so that's where it's not a hill I'm going to die on. But as I apply theology, I think it's probably best not to. In most circumstances. Are there better situations than other? Absolutely. To fight for the Canadian military is a lot closer to the kingdom than to fight for the North Korean military.
True.
But
you're crazy. Sorry, I haven't said it yet this week, but you're crazy.
not a heretic. I'm just crazy this week.
You're rising up,
growing,
pal. You're
guys.
getting there.
This idea that you might be a part of the kingdom of this world if you join the military, that applies to every job anyone has.
But I think it's more clear there. Like,
No way. So there is an article yesterday
Yep.
about Facebook,
Yep.
right? Facebook had an internal memo at some point a little while ago that talked about how they recognized and they knew
Yeah.
that Instagram was toxic for teenage girls, and
Yeah.
they did nothing about it.
Yeah.
You're telling me that the person who's a Christian who works at is a person who's a Christian is more morally free to work at Facebook than to join the military? No, that's what you're saying. You're saying this one could possibly be used for evil, so better not go there. And I'm saying that exists for everything.
But I think the value of human life is different. It's not. I'm not saying that you couldn't be a Christian who's working at Facebook and all of a sudden feel conviction of the Holy Spirit. I need to quit my job because I know this is toxic. But the application of human life, the military's end will always be to end up taking human life. Taking a life, I think, is a different part than, yes, I'm a part of a system that causes harm. I supported McDonald's when I ate them last 3 weeks ago, and go, there's a lot of devaluing of human life and how that business operates. So yes, but I look at how we can directly close off doors to serving the kingdom's, this world kingdom's entity. And go, let's say my wife went back to school and went all the way to being a doctor. And the only job she could take in being a doctor, the only one that was available to her, was being a doctor performing abortions. I think, from a kingdom perspective, as a doctor, she should not take that role. But in another doctor's role, where she may be at times be asked to help in an assisted suicide, is different than directly fulfilling that role. And so for her, in that direct application, she can say, no, this is a line for me. Versus in the military, you have no ability to say no. You cannot disobey a direct order. Versus in other places, we can draw lines. We can choose where we participate and not. And yes, they are all, in any way we serve, and in any way we take a job, we are contributing to the kingdoms of this world. I would say that applies in churches too. We can be a part of a church that's
Yes.
trying to build our big old entity and make ourselves rich and successful like the rest of the world. So everywhere is a compromise. I think there's
everywhere has the opportunity to come.
Yes, and so I go, I think these can be some of the most direct ones, and that's why even breaking them down, military can be slightly different than police force, which is completely separate than owning a firearm. I think we can use wisdom in how close we get to those lines.
And I would argue that, and I'm only speaking in the Canadian context, and I would caution you against saying Canadian officers are better trained than American officers, because we don't know that.
Well, I know that even the length of time by which Canadians...
I'm just saying, we're not qualified to make some of those definitive statements. So I would caution you on that. There are excessive cultural differences between the two nations that complicate this and make it a really much more complicated issue. But I would just say, if you looked at the Canadian military, they would say their purpose is to defend Canada.
Sure.
I don't think that anybody is planning in the Canadian government right now, let's go take over another nation.
Correct.
And I think there is part of that represents this defense and this of who we are that does represent the heart of God, because God is our defender.
Yes.
And the military is used for lots of good. The military was used in peacekeeping assignments. The military has been used when there's been disasters in Canada. So to make a blanket statement like that, I just think is really, really dangerous.
I will not argue that their Canadian government hasn't been used in good things. again, the Romans 13, the sword of protection,
Mm-hmm.
all those pieces. I think, yes, God is using even the state, even the kingdom, even the military in good ends. But where we choose to participate can then compromise some of those things. They get back to the patient for men. I think that would be a line where Christians wouldn't have participated in anything to do with the Roman government. I will not participate in that because I then am serving another kingdom and helping it expand its ends. I would go so far, and this is a totally separate question, maybe I'm fishing for another one. I don't think Christians should be a part of politics. I really don't.
Oh, I disagree with you again.
I know you do, and I knew that would come, but I don't think a Christian should be involved in the participation of politics, serving to expand and enforce the kingdoms of this world. And I go,
You're assuming that if they are involved in politics, that's their end game, and
Totally.
that's what I would say. You can't say that, and I don't think that you can definitively say
yeah.
that God couldn't call someone into a certain area into an area of
And I wanted
but
to
that's
acknowledge
what
that.
but that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
I don't think a Christian should do this. Another way of saying that is God would not call someone to this. And that's where I go, I don't think you can make that statement. Just like someone could argue no guy could ever be involved in helping porn stars because every guy could potentially, get addicted to porn.
Right.
And yet,
It's a little bit like the Pharisees, right? Like I feel like that as I
Yeah.
listen to you, Colin. I'm not judging
No,
that.
you
I'm just
Pharisee.
thinking.
That's worse than a heretic.
I'm thinking that's where the Pharisees went, and
Yeah.
I think that's where Christianity has gone forever. It's not just the Pharisees. I'm just as bad at it.
Yeah.
We make decisions out of fear.
Yep.
Right? We're fearful that if I get too close, then I will cross the line and do this. So therefore, I will pull back. The
Yeah.
Pharisees added laws to existing ones,
Yeah.
and we just make them up because we're like, well, whatever. I think I've done that with my children. I'm scared that my children will make mistakes that I made,
Yeah.
so therefore they can't do X, Y, or Z.
Yeah.
They might not,
Yeah.
but I'm fearful of it, so I make that decision, right? And I think, so I like the way you're saying, Doug, but I'm like, it might be too open-ended, right? Like, we do have to have some boundaries in place. I think that's that wisdom piece.
Well, let me.
But I don't think we should be so radical as to stop people from serving if they feel like God is calling them
Let's
to
put
do
a
that.
full circle then. Let's bring accommodation language back in. I think yes, sure. God could absolutely allow and maybe even call somebody to work in those spots. But where I try to apply some of my theologies, I'm thinking the end result of the kingdom, that when Jesus' kingdom is fully established, there will be no need for military, no need for current politics, no need for policing. So those things are not future kingdom things that will be needed, and therefore, if you're not for us, you're against us. I think those ends then have to be doing something ultimately that is against the kingdom if they will no longer be one day. So can we accommodate, and can there be good from it, and can God call somebody into those places? I will concede and say sure. I don't think those things will end anywhere other than they will be cease to exist
the
in
flaw
God's
in your
ultimate kingdom.
argument then, though, is that you are saying because there's no police officers in the
Yeah.
kingdom of God,
Yeah.
we shouldn't be involved. Then your wife should quit her job because there'll be no hospitals in the kingdom of God either.
Fair.
This is what I'm like. We live in this present reality.
Yeah.
And we have to deal with this present
Yes.
reality. And yes, we look forward in hope,
Yeah.
but we also have to live in this present reality. And we can't just say that won't be in the kingdom of God, so I shouldn't be a part of it now, because we are called to be salt and we are called to be light.
Yeah.
And God could call someone to go join the military
Yeah.
and stay their whole career in there, because through that they're going to bring reformation and change to the military.
Sure.
And this is what I'm saying. You can't say that God couldn't do it,
Yeah.
because I believe God calls us as the people of God into all areas of society
Yeah.
to bring change. And
Yeah.
if we say no one can get in that area of society,
Yeah.
we cannot, as followers of Christ, be the salt and light in that area of society.
Then I guess this is where, using my personal examples of the people that I've talked with, who I care for and love, who are in the military, in the police force, all those pieces, I have never doubted that God could have called them in there. I guess I can pull back my statement and go, I don't think it's ever going to be God's ultimate end to support those things. And B, I would say, I would never encourage somebody to blindly do that. Unless you have a call from God directly, I really feel, and I can't shake this feeling that God wants me to apply for the police force. Maybe go ahead, but versus just, I'm just looking out for a career option. That sounds like a good one. I'll apply. that's where I go, I cannot get behind saying that would be a theological call.
But shouldn't we apply that principle of where is God calling me? And what is God asking me
Now
to do?
you're
and
being
where is
idealistic.
God-
I
No,
don't think...
is that not what we should ask all people to do?
Yes, but I don't think every 18-year-old who's looking, what job am I going to have in the future? The military's offering me some free schooling. If I do it, is
It is a
thinking
good
that
one.
way, right? And so I go, I think we should be applying that. Jesus said I don't do anything that I don't see the Father doing. So I think you could apply that to what I eat for lunch. Unfortunately, most people aren't, and so blanket statements, back to the big broad ones. I don't think Christians should just have a total thumbs up. You should join the politics or military or police force without having, I think, a direct leading from the Spirit. That's where I'll end my side of things.
All right. We are running close on time here. We're probably over. And I feel
Close.
like you guys have done a really good job today
Yeah.
of restating your opinion over and over. So I don't know that we're going to get anywhere beyond what's already been said on this question.
I'll concede it's not a clear black and white at all. I think there's room. I think God can use. I think God can even call individuals. I'm talking theological ideals. I don't think you can say, I think there's like just war theory. Although I don't think we can start with the premise that God's cool with these other than to use them for something, another ultimate end.
And I would say we live in a tension
Yeah.
right now where we are not yet in fully the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
And there will be a lot of things we don't need when we get into the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
And God is loving, and because He's loving, He cares about justice
Yeah.
in all areas of life.
Yeah.
And so He, I believe, can and will call people
Yeah.
into areas that maybe we would not normally think of going,
Yeah.
to go bring justice, not only through that organization like a police officer could do,
Yeah.
but to that organization by being salt and light in it.
Totally.
And I will say we need to use wisdom. So there you go.
You sit in the middle so you can live in the middle.
He always sits in the middle. Gotta be uncomfortable sitting on that fence.
It's a little tough sometimes. All right, guys. We will see you next week. Send in more questions. We love them.
We've got like 4 more still good questions. Though. Not that we don't want them,
Didn't even copy and paste the other 2 that came in.
but
this
we've
week.
got some good questions. So
Yeah.
if you're watching this week for the first time and you're like, wow, those are some good questions, we got some good ones for next week.
Totally.
And you can tune in and hear, you can hear good thoughts and Kyle's heresy. There you go. I did work it in at some point.
See you guys.
Bye.